Imagine you're walking down the street and you spot a puddle of water. Without thinking, you quickly step around it. Now imagine you're faced with a tough decision. Should you take a new job offer or stay in your current position? Suddenly, the quick reflex you had with that puddle doesn't work. Your brain is now working overtime to carefully weigh the pros and cons. This difference in how your brain handles these two situations is at the heart of Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. Kahneman takes us on a fascinating journey through how our minds work, breaking them into two systems that influence everything we do. System 1 and System 2. They sound like sci-fi characters, but in reality, they're how we think, sometimes fast and automatic, other times slow and deliberate. And understanding them? Well, it can completely change how we approach life, business, and decision-making. Part 1. Meet System 1 and System 2. Okay, let's break it down. Think about your brain like a super-efficient two-person team. System 1. The quick-witted, snap decision maker. It's your autopilot. When you meet someone, System 1 is already sizing them up, evaluating their mood based on their facial expression. It's the system that's got your back in routine situations, like dodging that puddle or recognizing a familiar face in a crowd. It's fast, almost automatic, and works without you even realizing it. System 2. The careful planner. This system is slower, more analytical, and works when you're faced with a problem that requires focus, like solving a complicated math problem or planning your next career move. When you're deeply engaged in a task, focusing hard, it's System 2 at work. The catch? System 1 is quick and efficient, but it's also a bit of a shortcut taker. It tends to make snap judgments and decisions based on patterns and past experiences, like the time you assumed someone was angry because they were frowning, but it turns out they were just thinking deeply. That's System 1, doing its best, but sometimes leading us astray. On the flip side, System 2 takes more effort, but it's also the one that helps us reason and make rational decisions. But here's the twist. System 2 is lazy. It prefers to rely on System 1 when it can, so even when we should be thinking things through carefully, we often let our autopilot take over. Part 2. The shortcuts we love, heuristics and biases. Now that we've met our two brain systems, let's talk about the tricks they play on us. Kahneman introduces us to heuristics, which are mental shortcuts that help us make decisions quickly, kind of like brain hacks. These shortcuts are helpful most of the time, but they can also lead us down some pretty tricky paths. The anchoring effect. Ever heard of first impressions? That's your brain's anchoring bias at work. Let's say you're shopping for a new laptop, and the first one you see costs $2,000. When you find one that costs $1,500, your brain automatically thinks, wow, what a deal, even if that $1,500 laptop is still overpriced. The anchor, the initial $2,000 price, sets the stage for all your future decisions, even though it has no real bearing on the laptop's value. Availability bias. Here's another one, availability bias. Imagine you're about to fly and you hear on the news about a recent plane crash. Suddenly you're filled with anxiety about getting on that flight, even though statistically, plane crashes are incredibly rare. Why? Because your brain tends to judge the likelihood of events based on how easily they pop into your mind. If a plane crash is fresh in your memory, it seems far more likely, even if the reality says otherwise. Substitution. Ever had a tough decision and you couldn't quite figure it out, so you started asking yourself simpler questions? That's substitution. It's when your brain swaps out a complex question for a simpler one. For example, instead of asking, should I invest in this risky stock? So swing your brain might shortcut to, do I feel lucky? This can lead to decisions based on gut feelings rather than logic. Part 3. Overconfidence. The double-edged sword. Next, Kahneman reveals one of our biggest cognitive weaknesses, overconfidence. We all think we're great at predicting the future, right? But guess what? Our ability to forecast, even when we have expert knowledge, is often hilariously flawed. Kahneman calls this the illusion of validity. It's the idea that we feel more confident in our predictions or judgments than we should, just because we've had some past successes. Ever watched a football game and thought, I totally knew that play was going to work? Or maybe you've been guilty of overspending on a sure-thing investment. The truth is, even the experts don't have a crystal ball, and our brains trick us into thinking we can see the future more clearly than we actually can. The planning fallacy. Let's talk about another form of overconfidence, the planning fallacy. This is when we predict that a task will take way less time or effort than it actually does. It's like when you tell yourself you'll write that report in 2 hours, but somehow 5 hours later, you're still typing away. Kahneman explains that we tend to be overly optimistic in our projections, forgetting to factor in past setbacks, challenges, or other unexpected delays. It's like we live in a world of perpetual, wishful thinking, where everything always seems easier than it really is. Why experts get it wrong. And it's not just everyday people who fall into this trap. Even experts are prone to overconfidence. Kahneman talks about how experts, whether they're doctors, economists, or stock analysts, often overestimate their ability to make accurate predictions. The more experienced you are, the more confident you may become in your judgment, even though your track record might be far from perfect. It's a phenomenon we call hindsight bias, where we overestimate our ability to have predicted an outcome after we know the result. Part 4. The Psychology of Choices and Risk. In the final section of the first half, Kahneman digs deep into how we make choices, especially when risks are involved. Here, he introduces prospect theory, which challenges the idea that we make rational decisions based purely on logic and calculations. Instead, people's decisions are swayed by psychological factors, specifically loss aversion. Loss aversion. We all hate losing, right? That's loss aversion. Kahneman's research shows that the pain we feel from a loss is far greater than the pleasure we get from a gain of the same size. Think about it. Losing $100 feels way worse than finding $100 feels good. This makes us risk-averse when it comes to gains, but strangely willing to take big risks to avoid losses. You've probably seen this in action in business and investing. People might hold on to losing stocks or assets far too long, hoping they'll bounce back. But the fear of realizing a loss, especially when it's tangible, feels much worse than the potential pleasure of making a gain. Framing effects. Finally, let's talk about how the framing of a decision can completely change our choices. It's not just what you say, but how you say it. For example, would you prefer a medical treatment with a 90% survival rate, or one with a 10% mortality rate? Both descriptions are the same, but the framing makes a huge difference in how people react. We are much more likely to take the 90% survival rate option, even though the statistical outcome is identical. Part 5. Meet the two selves. The experiencing self versus the remembering self. Okay, so let's shift gears and get a bit philosophical for a moment. Kahneman introduces us to two very different versions of ourselves, the experiencing self and the remembering self. Sounds like a psychological soap opera, right? But stick with me, because these two selves are crucial to understanding how we evaluate our lives and make decisions. The experiencing self. In the moment. The experiencing self is the part of you that's actually living through the moments. The one who's enjoying that scoop of ice cream, feeling the sun on your skin, or sweating through a grueling workout. This self is all about the now. It's the one you're most in touch with when you're actively experiencing life. Let's say you're having a vacation and you're spending the day at the beach. Your experiencing self is loving the sun, the waves, the sand between your toes, and that cool drink in your hand. It's all about the moment. The remembering self, the storyteller. Now, the remembering self is the one that does the reflecting. After your beach vacation, when you talk to friends about how amazing it was, it's not really the experiencing self doing the talking, it's your remembering self. This is the part of you that recalls the good times and frames the story in your mind. The funny thing is, the remembering self doesn't always get it right. It's influenced by how things ended and the peak moments of your experience. So, what does this mean? Well, Kahneman reveals that our memories of experiences are far more important to us than the actual experiences themselves. You might have had a whole vacation filled with wonderful moments, but if your trip ended with a delayed flight or a bad meal, that negative experience could dominate your memories. It's called the peak end rule, where the best or worst moment, plus how something ends, determines how we remember it. Part 6. Prospect theory. Why we're terrible at handling risk all right. Let's talk money. Thinking fast and slow dives into something that directly impacts your wallet. Prospect theory. Kahneman and his partner, Amos Tversky, completely revolutionized how we think about decision-making with this theory. Loss aversion. The pain of losing versus the joy of gaining. Here's the deal. Prospect theory tells us that people are far more sensitive to losses than to equivalent gains. Imagine you lose $100. Ouch, right? Now imagine you find $100. Nice. But you're probably not jumping for joy. For most people, losing $100 feels worse than finding $100 feels good. It's because losses hurt more than gains feel good, and that's called loss aversion. This powerful bias explains why we're so bad at taking risks when it comes to gains, but why we're willing to gamble to avoid a loss. Think of the stock market. People will often hold on to bad investments, hoping they'll recover, because the pain of admitting a loss is worse than the potential gain of moving on. The endowment effect. Why we overvalue what we own. Now let's talk about the endowment effect. That strange tendency we have to value things more just because they're ours. You've probably noticed this in your own life. Ever tried to sell something you no longer need, like an old guitar, and thought, I'm not giving this up for less than $200, even though it's worth $50. That's the endowment effect at work. Because it's yours, you think it's worth more than it actually is. In other words, just owning something makes it feel more valuable. This can cause all sorts of problems in decision-making, like overpricing your stuff when selling, or being reluctant to part with things that no longer serve you. Part 7. Overconfidence. How we fool ourselves. Okay, let's get real for a moment. How many of you have ever thought, I totally knew that was going to happen? We all fall victim to overconfidence. In fact, Kahneman shows us how we're all a bit delusional when it comes to our own abilities and predictions. The illusion of validity. Thinking we're better than we are. The illusion of validity is the belief that we understand things far better than we actually do. It's the feeling of certainty we get after making a decision, even when we don't have all the information. Have you ever been super sure about an answer on a quiz, only to find out you were wrong? That's overconfidence in action. It's the same thing with investments. Investors often feel confident about their stock picks, even though the market is unpredictable and there's no way to guarantee success. It's easy to become attached to your beliefs and experiences, but this often leads to poor judgment because we ignore uncertainty or contradictory evidence. The planning fallacy. This will only take 10 minutes. We all do this. We're sitting at our desk planning out a project and think to ourselves, this will only take about an hour to finish. Cut to 5 hours later and we're still at it. That's the planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate how long a task will take. We get overconfident about our abilities in the future, even when history has shown us otherwise. It's like starting a home renovation project and thinking it'll be done by the weekend. We forget about all the little obstacles that inevitably pop up along the way, like unexpected costs or the fact that we'll have to make a trip to the hardware store. Over and over, we fall into this trap of over-optimism, and it leads to disappointment and stress. Part 8. How we make choices under risk. Now let's take a dive into one of the most fascinating parts of the book. How we make decisions when things aren't certain. Kahneman explains that when we're faced with risk, we don't act as rational decision makers. Instead, our choices are driven by emotional biases. Risk aversion, the fear of losing, more than gaining. When it comes to making risky decisions, people usually go for safety. Why? Because of loss aversion. Let's say you're offered a gamble. You can either take a guaranteed $50 or roll the dice for a chance to win $100. Most people will take the guaranteed $50, even though the gamble has a higher expected payoff. That's because the fear of losing $50 feels worse than the excitement of gaining $100. It's the same in business. Companies often shy away from taking risks, even when the potential rewards are much larger. This behavior leads to overly cautious decisions like avoiding innovation or missing out on opportunities for growth. Framing effects. How you present options can change everything. Let's take a quick look at framing effects. How you frame a decision can dramatically change how people perceive it. This is why advertisers, politicians, and marketers are so good at influencing us. Imagine a surgeon offers you two options for surgery. Option A has a 90% survival rate, and option B has a 10% mortality rate. Even though these are the same, the way they're framed influences how we feel about them. The way decisions are framed affects how we approach them emotionally. We tend to react more positively to survival rates than mortality rates, even if they mean the same thing. This is a perfect example of how framing can nudge us toward a decision without us even realizing it. Part 9. Nudge Theory and Real-World Implications. In the final chapters of the book, Kahneman explores something super practical: nudge theory. This concept is all about how small changes in how options are presented can lead people to make better decisions without actually limiting their freedom. Think of it as a gentle push in the right direction. Nudge theory. Making better choices without force. Governments and companies are increasingly using nudges to help people make decisions. For example, automatic enrollment in retirement savings plans nudges people to save for the future without requiring them to take any action. People are much more likely to stick with the default option, saving for retirement, than if they had to actively opt in. The beauty of nudging is that it doesn't take away choices. Instead, it subtly shifts people's behavior toward better decisions by leveraging our cognitive biases. You're still free to opt out of the plan, but the fact that it's the default means you're far more likely to stick with it. Closing thoughts. Applying these insights in the real world. This book isn't just for psychologists or neuroscientists, it's for all of us. Whether you're managing your finances, making career decisions, navigating relationships, or even just figuring out what to have for dinner, understanding how we think and why we think the way we do can profoundly change the way we approach problems and decisions. The beauty of Kahneman's work is that it's accessible and applicable. You don't have to change your entire way of thinking to benefit from these insights. You just need to be a bit more mindful of when your mind is playing tricks on you and take a moment to think more critically. So, the next time you're making a big decision, remember, slow down, reflect, and think carefully. Your brain might thank you for it,